Sit back, relax, and welcome to Reading Hours. Today's book is A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. Please let us know in the comments from where you are watching, or if there is a book you want us to summarize in future. James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is one of the most celebrated works of modernist literature, offering a deep, introspective look into the formation of an artist's consciousness. Published in 1916, it traces the coming-of-age journey of Stephen Dedalus, Joyce's semi-autobiographical protagonist, as he navigates his youth in late 19th century Ireland. Through Stephen's experiences, Joyce explores themes of identity, artistic expression, religion, and nationalism, all while experimenting with narrative techniques that would influence future generations of writers. Often regarded as a groundbreaking work in the Modernist movement, the novel challenges conventional storytelling, moving beyond mere plot to focus intensely on the inner life of its protagonist. It brings to the forefront Joyce's distinctive style, marked by rich symbolism, stream of consciousness techniques, and a fractured sense of time. A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is not merely the story of one man's development, but also an exploration of the complex forces that shape the individual, family, faith, culture, and the call of the artistic vocation. As we delve into Stephen Dedalus's growth from a child to a young man, we will witness his intellectual and emotional struggles as he breaks away from the constraints of his environment, seeking to define himself and his art. Joyce's rich, layered prose and the evolving consciousness of Stephen make this novel a cornerstone in the study of literature and the human condition. Now, let's dive into the first chapter of Stephen's journey. The story begins in the early years of Stephen Dedalus, who is introduced as a young child in the religious and politically charged atmosphere of Dublin. Stephen's early life is dominated by his strict Catholic upbringing, and the novel opens with his perception of the world through the lens of a child, confused, fragmented, but full of sensory impressions. As he listens to his father's scattered and often incoherent remarks, Stephen is first introduced to the concept of guilt and the weight of Catholic dogma, something that will become a significant theme throughout the novel. Stephen's family is not financially stable, and his father's erratic behavior creates an environment of instability in his childhood. These early experiences form the backdrop for Stephen's gradual awakening to the complexities of adult life. His father's financial failures and the subsequent strain on the family affect Stephen's early education, and he begins to form his own sense of separation from his family, especially his mother, who represents the Catholic ideal of devotion and submission. Despite the familial pressure, Stephen seeks to carve out an identity for himself beyond the expectations placed on him by both his parents and society. In the religious school that Stephen attends, he encounters an environment that is both nurturing and oppressive. The schoolmaster, who embodies the Catholic ideals of discipline and order, imparts the values of sin and redemption in a way that becomes deeply ingrained in Stephen's consciousness. It is here that Stephen's internal struggle begins to take shape, as he starts to question the moral framework imposed upon him. His guilt and shame over seemingly minor actions are reflections of the deep religious indoctrination that surrounds him. This sense of guilt becomes a powerful, defining force in Stephen's young life. And the reader is introduced to the idea that Stephen's relationship with religion is one of tension rather than reverence. Stephen's moments of self-reflection are vivid, as Joyce delves into his inner world with a prose style that mirrors the complexity of his thoughts. This is particularly evident in Stephen's memories of his interactions with other boys at school, where he begins to feel increasingly alienated. His sensitivity to the judgments of others and his awareness of his difference from the other boys highlight his burgeoning self-consciousness. At this point in his life, Stephen is not yet fully aware of his artistic calling, but the seeds of his individuality are already beginning to take root. His emotional responses to the world around him are raw and unfiltered, yet they set the stage for his later artistic development. As Stephen struggles with the expectations placed upon him, both as a son and a student, he begins to form his first inklings of rebellion. The world around him is rigid and suffocating, and Stephen's desire to break free from the constraints of his upbringing becomes increasingly evident. His awareness of the hypocrisy in the world around him, particularly within the religious structures, leads him to question not only the faith he was raised in, but also the very notion of duty and responsibility. Stephen's relationship with his family, especially his mother, becomes more strained as he tries to assert his independence. The tension between family loyalty and the desire for self-expression becomes central to Stephen's journey. As he grows older, Stephen becomes more attuned to the societal pressures that dictate his behavior. His experiences in the schoolyard, as well as his budding intellectual curiosity, lead him to question the suffocating norms of Irish society. The allure of the outside world, with its promises of freedom and artistic expression, becomes ever more appealing to him. Joyce's portrayal of Stephen's early childhood is marked by a sense of fragmentation, a disjointedness that reflects the chaos of the world he inhabits. The narrative jumps between different moments in Stephen's life, capturing the fluidity of his thoughts and perceptions, and immersing the reader in his complex inner life. In Part 1, Joyce lays the groundwork for Stephen's gradual disillusionment with the world around him. His interactions with his family, the priests, and his peers shape his understanding of his own identity. This internal conflict, coupled with his growing desire to find his own path, sets the stage for the rest of the novel, as Stephen begins to break away from the forces that have tried to define him. The tension between conformity and individuality will continue to play a pivotal role in Stephen's development. And it is through this lens that we begin to see the early formation of the artist Stephen will become. Stephen's time at school becomes an increasingly complex battleground where his personal conflicts begin to take shape, influencing not only his self-perception, but also his understanding of the world. The narrative shifts focus from his early childhood to his teenage years, marking a period of heightened intellectual curiosity and emotional turbulence. His mind, which was once absorbed in the simple joys and fears of childhood, now begins to wrestle with more abstract questions. The boundary between the security of religious instruction and the possibility of personal freedom becomes the central issue for Stephen as he navigates adolescence. In this phase, Stephen begins to see the world more critically, particularly the oppressive structures that govern his life. At school, he is exposed to the hierarchical nature of both the Catholic Church and the Irish society. These institutions are depicted as rigid, controlling forces that shape the lives of those within them. Stephen's growing awareness of the moral and intellectual limitations imposed by these forces leads him to reject them. This internal conflict is amplified by his academic struggles, which are more pronounced as he moves through his school years. Stephen feels the weight of societal expectations bearing down on him, pushing him toward a future he doesn't desire. The tension between the life he is expected to lead and the life he yearns for becomes ever more pronounced. The narrative now introduces the idea of shame, an emotion that Stephen feels deeply throughout his teenage years. Joyce's portrayal of shame is multifaceted. It is both a tool used by the church and society to control behavior, and an intense, internalized emotion that shapes Stephen's self-image. Early in the story, Stephen experiences the feelings of inadequacy and guilt that come from trying to meet the high moral standards set by his family and his religious education. However, as his mind develops, Stephen begins to distance himself from the self-flagellation that is ingrained in his Catholic upbringing. He begins to question the value of guilt and whether it is a force for good or simply a way to manipulate his conscience. Stephen's relationship with his family begins to sour during this period. His father, once an imposing but largely distant figure in his early years, becomes an increasingly troubling presence in Stephen's life. The father's financial instability, his drunken outbursts, and his inability to provide a stable home life exacerbate the conflict Stephen feels between loyalty to his family and the desire to escape the limitations they impose. Stephen's mother, on the other hand, is a figure of devotion and submission, constantly reinforcing the idea of piety and the importance of fulfilling religious obligations. For Stephen, her unyielding adherence to Catholicism seems stifling. He begins to see her faith as something that binds him to a life of spiritual servitude, rather than something that might provide solace. This growing sense of alienation from his family mirrors Stephen's increasing alienation from the church. During this time, Stephen's mind begins to rebel against the dogma that has shaped his worldview. The priests, who had once seemed like wise mentors, now appear as authoritarian figures, controlling not just the moral lives of their followers, but also their very thoughts. Stephen's intellectual capacity for questioning becomes more pronounced, and he starts to recognize the dissonance between the ideals of the church and the reality of his personal experiences. The church, which once promised certainty and stability, now seems to offer nothing but guilt and restriction. The crisis point comes when Stephen is introduced to the concept of sin and its profound consequences. His growing awareness of sexuality further complicates his relationship with Catholicism. Stephen finds himself both attracted to and repulsed by the idea of sin, particularly in relation to his emerging sexuality. He is fascinated by the allure of women, but also feels an intense guilt about his desires. This internal conflict culminates in a moment of intense shame when Stephen becomes aware of his sexual feelings toward a woman. His mind races with conflicting thoughts, and he is unable to reconcile his natural instincts with the moral teachings he has been raised with. Joyce masterfully illustrates the inner turmoil of Stephen's psyche, drawing attention to the way in which the Church's teachings contribute to his sense of guilt and self-loathing. At the same time, Stephen's intellectual development begins to take a more distinct shape. His reading and his engagement with literature provide an outlet for his questioning of the world around him. Books become an escape from the rigid expectations of religion and family, offering him a space where he can explore ideas and perspectives outside of the narrow confines of his upbringing. It is during this period that Stephen begins to develop an understanding of the artist's role in society, even though he is not yet fully aware of how this understanding will manifest in his own life. Stephen's yearning for freedom from the confining structures of religion and family becomes more pronounced, but it is also fraught with emotional complexity. His desire to break free from the past is not without its own sense of guilt and fear. He is torn between his loyalty to his family and his growing desire for independence. Joyce portrays this internal struggle in vivid, almost tangible terms, making Stephen's personal conflict one of the most compelling aspects of the novel. Stephen's journey is not simply about leaving behind the constraints of his upbringing. It is about the difficult process of defining himself and finding his own voice as an artist. This process will continue to unfold as Stephen grows older and more certain of his path. By the end of this section, Stephen's rebellion is not yet complete, but it is unmistakably on the horizon. He is beginning to see the world in a new light, one that challenges the very foundations of the life he has known. The shifting dynamics between Stephen and the other characters in his life, his parents, his teachers, his fellow students, mark the early stages of his artistic evolution. The stage is set for Stephen's eventual escape from the life that has been mapped out for him, and the narrative momentum builds toward the inevitable moment of transformation. This is a story about the complexities of growing up, the pain of self-discovery, and the courage it takes to defy the forces that seek to control the individual. Stephen's inner conflict is a universal experience, one that resonates with anyone who has ever had to choose between the world they were born into and the one they dream of creating for themselves. Stephen's journey becomes increasingly marked by his struggle to define his identity in the face of overwhelming external pressures. The growing complexity of his intellectual and emotional life forces him to confront deeper questions about his role in the world, his relationship to the Catholic faith, and his vision for the future. Stephen's awareness of his differences from others continues to shape his experiences. The more he engages with the world, the more he begins to feel the weight of his alienation. This feeling is rooted in his inability to fit into the prescribed roles that his family, his religion, and society at large expect of him. By now, Stephen's intellectual development has progressed significantly, and he begins to critically evaluate the systems of power and control that surround him. The school, the church, and even the Irish society itself. These are all institutions that demand conformity, and each represents a different form of restriction. However, Stephen's growing desire for independence, for personal freedom, forces him to question their authority more intensely. His deepening intellectual curiosity pushes him further away from the teachings he once accepted without question. Stephen's rejection of his childhood faith and the pressures of his family become a primary focus of his internal conflict. Despite his growing doubts about the Catholic Church, Stephen's fear of eternal damnation still looms large over him. The notion of sin and its consequences continues to trouble him, especially as he contemplates the nature of human desire, particularly sexual desire, which is both an attraction and a source of guilt for him. Joyce presents this struggle as an ongoing internal dialogue, where Stephen is continuously battling his own feelings of shame and the teachings of the Church. Each interaction with the priesthood and the Church rituals deepens his understanding of the moral framework that governs his life, but it also strengthens his resolve to break free from its confines. Stephen's moments of spiritual doubt become more intense as he grows older. The formal rituals of Catholicism, once something he adhered to with a sense of duty, become increasingly alienating. During this period, Stephen begins to experience a profound sense of spiritual emptiness, as the rituals and prayers he once found comforting now seem hollow and mechanistic. This emotional crisis leads him to consider the possibility that the path set before him by the Church is not one he can follow. However, this realization is not instantaneous. It is something that Stephen wrestles with over time, and the process of rejecting his faith is depicted as gradual and painful. He is torn between the comfort of the familiar and the lure of intellectual independence. The relationship between Stephen and his parents also reaches a breaking point. Stephen's mother, who has been a symbol of religious devotion throughout his life, represents the deep-rooted Catholicism that he can no longer embrace. Her fervent belief in the teachings of the Church is something that Stephen finds increasingly suffocating. In contrast, his father, a once proud man whose life has been marked by instability and failure, becomes a symbol of the limitations Stephen wishes to escape. The contradictions within his family life, his father's emotional and financial instability, his mother's piousness, serve as the backdrop for Stephen's growing desire to assert his individuality and break free from the constraints of his upbringing. Despite the deep internal conflict, Stephen finds moments of clarity. His growing sense of artistic identity begins to take shape as he explores the possibilities of writing as a means of self-expression. The books he reads and the ideas he encounters become the foundation for his artistic vision, providing him with a language to articulate the struggle he faces. Stephen's early attempts at writing, however, are fraught with insecurity and doubt. He is unsure of his own abilities, and he struggles with the tension between his desire to break free from the traditions of his upbringing and the fear of alienating himself from his family and his culture. At the same time, Stephen's relationship with the world of women becomes more complicated. He finds himself both attracted to and repelled by the idea of romantic and sexual relationships. His encounters with women are portrayed with a mixture of desire and guilt, as Stephen attempts to reconcile his natural instincts with the moral code that has been ingrained in him since childhood. His sexual desires, which are central to his emotional and intellectual development, are something that he can neither suppress nor fully embrace. They are another form of rebellion, but they are also another source of shame. It is during this period that Stephen experiences a kind of spiritual crisis, a profound sense of alienation from both the religious and familial structures that have dominated his life. He seeks solace in intellectualism, art, and literature, but he is not yet certain how to navigate the path that lies ahead. His sense of alienation deepens, and it becomes clear that his future lies in forging an individual identity outside the constraints of the life he has known. Joyce presents Stephen's intellectual journey as both a painful and liberating process, one that is filled with moments of self-doubt, confusion, and fear, but also moments of clarity and realization. Stephen's intellectual and spiritual struggles, however, are not without their moments of epiphany. His increasing awareness of his artistic potential allows him to glimpse the possibility of a life beyond the church and beyond his family. It is in this moment of awakening that Stephen begins to see the artist not only as a rebel, but as a creator, someone capable of constructing a new vision of the world. Art, for Stephen, becomes the means of expressing his deepest truths, even if these truths are uncomfortable and difficult to accept. The sense of artistic freedom is intoxicating to Stephen, offering him a way to transcend the limitations imposed by his upbringing and to craft a new identity for himself. The turning point comes when Stephen experiences a moment of intense clarity, a vision of the life he wants to lead, one in which he can embrace his individuality and his creativity without the weight of guilt and obligation. This moment of insight marks the beginning of Stephen's transition from a young man caught between conflicting forces to an artist who is beginning to understand the full scope of his potential. The process of defining himself, of rejecting the forces that have held him back, becomes a central theme in the remainder of his journey. The choice to embrace his artistic destiny is not a simple one, and it requires Stephen to navigate the complex terrain of guilt, desire, and self-awareness. In the end, this period of Stephen's life is characterized by both rejection and acceptance, rejecting the life that has been prescribed for him, while slowly accepting the responsibility of forging his own path. It is a period of intense personal transformation, one that sets the stage for the artist he is becoming. Stephen's journey towards self-discovery continues to unfold as he delves deeper into his artistic ambitions, increasingly rejecting the societal, familial, and religious expectations that have shaped much of his early life. As he navigates the tension between conformity and individuality, his internal battles grow more pronounced. Yet his desire to pursue an authentic, self-created identity remains steadfast. In his ongoing intellectual and spiritual quest, Stephen's perceptions of the world around him evolve dramatically. Each interaction, whether with his peers, his teachers, or strangers, serves to further sharpen his awareness of the distance between himself and the life that has been imposed on him. In the midst of this tumult, Stephen begins to embrace a new philosophy, one of radical individuality and artistic freedom. His sense of identity becomes increasingly tied to his role as an artist, and as he embraces his intellectual independence, he grows ever more certain that his future lies in the realm of art. Yet, as he does so, he continues to be acutely aware of the isolation his decisions create. The journey to self-actualization is not without sacrifice, and Stephen begins to see his alienation as both an inevitable consequence and a necessary part of his development. In his refusal to be shaped by the forces around him, Stephen understands that he must remain steadfast in his convictions, even if this path leads him further away from those he loves and those who have invested in his future. At the same time, Stephen's relationship with women grows in complexity. His previous experiences with sexuality and attraction, tinged with guilt and confusion, evolve as he begins to see women not merely as objects of desire, but as individuals with their own agency. However, Stephen's evolving relationship with women does not come without its own struggles. His sense of guilt and shame, conditioned by years of Catholic doctrine, still haunt him, creating a push and pull between his artistic independence and his ingrained sense of morality. This tension plays a significant role in Stephen's psychological and emotional development. As he grapples with the competing forces of desire and morality that continue to shape his perception of himself and his place in the world. Stephen's encounters with other intellectuals and thinkers further bolster his belief that the path he is charting for himself is the only one worth pursuing. Conversations with peers and mentors begin to expose the gaps in his own understanding. Yet they also provide him with the intellectual tools to critically engage with the world in a way that is uniquely his own. His experience at university becomes a crucial turning point in this regard. It is in this environment, surrounded by intellectual peers, that Stephen begins to see the full extent of his own potential. He comes to understand that the artist, while at times lonely and isolated, is also part of a larger tradition of intellectual freedom and rebellion. It is through the lens of this intellectual community that Stephen begins to fully embrace the idea that his art must not only be a reflection of his inner self, but a vehicle for exploring and challenging the world around him. Despite his growing conviction, Stephen's sense of alienation is never far from his mind. While he continues to reject the religious orthodoxy that once shaped his life, he remains deeply affected by the weight of guilt and the societal expectations of behavior that were instilled in him. The internal battle between his desire for freedom and the persistent pull of guilt intensifies as he becomes more fully aware of the emotional cost of his choices. His rejection of his past, however, is not without moments of doubt. He begins to question whether his pursuit of art and individualism is a true reflection of his own desires, or simply a reaction against the oppressive forces he has faced throughout his life. The tension between these two possibilities, freedom from repression versus the desire for authenticity, becomes a central struggle for Stephen. Stephen's journey is also marked by a series of epiphanies, moments where his understanding of his identity and purpose crystallizes. These moments of insight, however, are often fleeting and fragile, disappearing as quickly as they appear. Stephen realizes that his growth as an artist will require him to constantly challenge his own assumptions, even as he continues to confront the external pressures that seek to define him. This realization further deepens his resolve to pursue his art with unflinching dedication, even if it means embracing solitude and rejection. The artist, for Stephen, must be willing to step away from the crowd, to isolate himself in the pursuit of his craft. This, he believes, is the only way to truly find himself. one of the most significant moments in Stephen's emotional and intellectual development occurs when he begins to see his art not merely as a personal endeavor, but as something that can potentially shape the future of Irish culture and society. It is a moment of profound understanding that his creative output has the potential to transcend the personal and resonate with the collective. Stephen's vision of the artist as a revolutionary figure takes shape, and he comes to see his role in society as one that must challenge the prevailing norms and conventions. The artist, in his view, must be both a mirror of the world and a force that distorts and reconfigures that world in ways that offer new perspectives and possibilities. Yet, despite his intellectual growth and his increasing confidence in his artistic abilities, Stephen remains deeply ambivalent about the implications of his chosen path. He recognizes the sacrifices that will be required of him and the personal cost of his rejection of the institutions that have shaped his life. As he moves further away from his family, his faith, and his country, he faces the harsh reality that his pursuit of art may come at the expense of personal relationships and emotional fulfillment. These questions weigh heavily on him as he contemplates the future, unsure of the ultimate consequences of his choices. Stephen's internal conflict also manifests in his struggle with his own sense of identity. He feels a constant need to justify his rejection of the world that has shaped him, even as he becomes more convinced of the validity of his artistic path. The emotional turbulence of this period in Stephen's life is palpable as he moves back and forth between moments of clarity and confusion, between certainty and doubt. The artist's journey for Stephen is not a smooth one, but one marked by tension, contradiction, and a continual search for meaning. This period of Stephen's life becomes one of intense intellectual and emotional conflict. The rejection of societal norms, religious orthodoxy, and familial expectations does not come easily. And Stephen's growing sense of self-awareness is tinged with uncertainty and fear. Yet, through it all, he remains resolute in his belief that the artist's path is the only one that can provide him with the freedom and purpose he seeks. Stephen's internal conflict continues to deepen as his journey toward artistic and intellectual independence reaches a new intensity. As he moves through the various stages of his life, he becomes increasingly aware of the complexity of his emotional and intellectual development. Stephen's pursuit of his artistic identity is no longer just a personal endeavor, but a mission that is intertwined with the very essence of his being. His vision of himself as an artist, one who must break free from the constraints of family, religion, and national identity, becomes even more firmly established. However, his rejection of these forces places him in an increasingly isolated position, and the emotional toll of his decisions weighs heavily on him. One of the most significant developments in Stephen's character is his growing awareness of the tension between his intellectual and spiritual worlds. For much of his youth, Stephen's life has been shaped by the presence of the Catholic Church, which, in many ways, has defined his understanding of morality, guilt, and personal responsibility. However, as Stephen matures, he begins to perceive the limitations and contradictions of the religious teachings that have shaped his early life. The guilt that once haunted him, particularly in relation to his sexual desires, is now seen through a new lens. Rather than being something to be overcome, this guilt becomes part of the fabric of his understanding of the world, a complex, multifaceted emotion that cannot simply be ignored or easily discarded. At the same time, Stephen's increasing intellectual sophistication leads him to confront the limitations of his previous beliefs. The rigid doctrines of Catholicism, which once felt suffocating and all-encompassing, begin to appear less as truths and more as constraints on his intellectual and creative freedom. He increasingly sees religion not as a pathway to salvation, but as an obstacle to self-expression and artistic growth. Yet, despite his growing rejection of the Church's authority, Stephen's relationship with religion is far from straightforward. It is not so much that he abandons faith entirely, but rather that he recognizes the profound influence it has had on him and the role it continues to play in his internal struggle. Stephen's relationship with his family, particularly his father, remains strained and complicated. While Stephen has long resented the expectations placed upon him by his parents, especially his father's inability to provide for the family, he is also painfully aware of the sacrifices that have been made for him. The conflict between love and resentment, between gratitude and frustration, defines Stephen's interactions with his family. At the same time, Stephen's growing sense of independence leads him to view his family not as a source of support, but as another institution that must be escaped if he is to realize his artistic vision. The gulf between Stephen and his family widens as he becomes more committed to his personal journey, even as he struggles with the guilt of leaving them behind. Yet, for all his internal turmoil, Stephen remains driven by a singular, overarching goal: to find his voice as an artist. This drive is not simply about creating art for the sake of artistic expression, but about articulating a new vision of the world, one that is uniquely his own. Stephen's vision of art evolves as he grows older, and he begins to see himself not just as a passive observer of the world, but as an active participant in shaping it. Art, for Stephen, is a way of expressing his innermost thoughts and desires, a means of breaking free from the constraints of the past, and a tool for interrogating the world around him. As Stephen continues his education at university, he becomes increasingly focused on the intellectual and artistic traditions that have shaped his thinking. The books he reads, the ideas he encounters, and the conversations he has with fellow students and professors all contribute to his growing sense of purpose. However, Stephen's intellectual pursuits are not without their own set of challenges. As he engages with these ideas, he realizes that the intellectual world is not as straightforward as he once thought. The competing philosophies and theories that he encounters leave him both invigorated and disillusioned as he struggles to find a place for himself within this intellectual landscape. Stephen's experiences with love and sexuality continue to evolve as well. He finds himself drawn to women, yet he remains conflicted about the role of sexuality in his life. For much of his youth, he was taught to view sex through the lens of guilt and shame, and these emotions continue to haunt him as he navigates his relationships. Yet, as Stephen matures, he begins to understand that sexuality is not simply a source of guilt, but a part of the human experience that must be reckoned with in a more nuanced way. His relationships with women become more complex as he struggles to reconcile his desires with his sense of guilt and morality. In many ways, his experiences with love and sexuality mirror his larger journey of self-discovery. As he comes to terms with the tensions between his desires and his sense of duty to his family, his faith, and his country. Despite his growing sense of independence, Stephen's relationship with his country remains fraught with tension. Ireland, as both a physical and cultural entity, represents a number of forces that Stephen has come to reject: the political oppression, the religious orthodoxy, and the societal expectations that stifle individuality and self-expression. Yet, as Stephen rejects his country's influence, he finds himself increasingly torn between his desire to escape and the lingering attachment he feels to the land of his birth. He is keenly aware of the cultural and historical weight of Ireland, and this awareness shapes his understanding of his role as an artist. Stephen's rejection of his country is not merely a rejection of its institutions, but a profound realization that, in order to create freely, he must sever his ties to the past and embrace a new, self-fashioned identity. As Stephen continues to wrestle with these competing forces, he begins to realize that the artist's journey is one of continuous conflict and transformation. The tension between the individual and society, between freedom and responsibility, between desire and guilt, is never fully resolved. Stephen's understanding of himself and his purpose as an artist becomes more fluid and uncertain as he navigates this complex terrain. Yet, despite the uncertainty that characterizes his journey, he remains committed to his vision of himself as an artist, a vision that is increasingly defined by the rejection of societal norms and the embrace of artistic freedom. In this way, Stephen's story is not simply about personal growth, but about the larger struggle of the artist to find a voice in a world that often seems indifferent or hostile to individual expression. Stephen's struggles, both internal and external, reflect the universal quest for self-identity, and his journey resonates with anyone who has ever questioned the roles that society, religion, or family have prescribed for them. His refusal to be defined by others, and his determination to create a life of his own making, makes Stephen a figure of both tragic isolation and profound artistic triumph. Stephen Dedalus' journey toward personal freedom and artistic identity becomes even more tumultuous as his intellectual and emotional maturation intensifies. Having rejected the constraints of family, religion, and nationalism, Stephen continues his inner journey, increasingly alienating himself from the forces that once defined him. His choices are no longer shaped by the expectations of those around him, but rather by his own desires and convictions. However, this independence comes at a cost. Stephen's isolation deepens, and he finds himself grappling with the loneliness that accompanies his relentless pursuit of self-expression and truth. As Stephen delves further into the exploration of his artistic self, his awareness of the profound tension between his creative aspirations and the demands of society becomes more pronounced. He begins to see the world through the lens of the artist, recognizing that true artistic expression requires both a profound engagement with one's environment and an equally profound detachment from it. This duality, being both part of and apart from the world, becomes a defining theme in Stephen's development. He realizes that, in order to create art, he must withdraw from from the conventional norms that surround him, even as he continues to engage with them on an intellectual level. Art, for Stephen, becomes a means of both transcending and confronting the constraints of his upbringing, his culture, and his past. The internal conflict between Stephen's desires and his sense of responsibility continues to intensify. The weight of his choices begins to bear down on him as he contemplates the consequences of rejecting his Catholic faith and the societal structures that have shaped his identity. Although he has consciously distanced himself from religion and nationalism, Stephen is never fully free of their influence. The guilt he once felt about his desires and choices continues to haunt him, albeit in a more complex and nuanced form. For Stephen, rejecting the authority of the Church and the societal expectations of his country is not as simple as an act of defiance. It is a continual struggle against the ingrained beliefs that still echo within him. Despite the personal cost of his intellectual and artistic pursuits, Stephen is driven by an undeniable need to assert his individuality. He sees himself as an artist, not merely in the sense of creating art, but in the broader, almost philosophical sense of existing as a unique entity in the world. The idea of the artist as a solitary figure, one who must forge his own path and grapple with the complexities of existence, is central to Stephen's evolving self-concept. To be an artist, Stephen believes, is to accept isolation and alienation as inherent parts of the creative process. This is not a position he embraces easily, but one he feels is inevitable if he is to create art that is truly his own. One of the most profound aspects of Stephen's artistic vision is his growing understanding of the relationship between the artist and his work. He comes to view art as a means of self-expression, a way of articulating the deepest aspects of his being. Art, in this sense, becomes a tool for revealing the inner workings of the soul, a way of making the invisible visible. For Stephen, the artist's role is not to reflect the world as it is, but to transform it, to see beyond its surface and capture its underlying truths. This vision of art is both empowering and isolating. It demands not only a profound understanding of the world, but also a willingness to detach oneself from it in order to express something more authentic and pure. In his growing intellectual and emotional isolation, Stephen grapples with the question of what it means to be an artist in a world that is often indifferent to the individual. He is increasingly aware of the sacrifices that come with artistic creation, the personal cost of alienation, the burden of self-doubt, and the weight of unspoken expectations. Yet, despite these challenges, Stephen remains resolute in his commitment to his craft. His growing sense of self as an artist is intertwined with a deep understanding of the responsibility that comes with creation. To be an artist, he realizes, is to bear the burden of both the work and the self that produces it. The artist must live with the consequences of his creations, which may be misunderstood, rejected, or ignored by the world. But Stephen also recognizes that this is the price of authenticity. He is willing to endure the hardships of isolation and rejection because he believes that, through his work, he can achieve a level of self-expression that is both deeply personal and universally significant. As Stephen's intellectual exploration continues, he begins to understand the importance of language and narrative in shaping his artistic identity. The power of words, the rhythm of language, and the fluidity of meaning becomes central to his artistic vision. Language is no longer just a tool for communication, but a means of creating and shaping reality. In this sense, Stephen comes to see his own existence as a kind of narrative, a story that he must actively craft and shape in order to achieve artistic freedom. His evolving relationship with language and narrative reflects his growing understanding of the artist's role in creating meaning out of chaos, in shaping an individual story from the vastness of existence. Stephen's relationship with the world around him remains complicated. He rejects the institutions that have shaped him, religion, family, nation, and yet he cannot completely escape their influence. As much as he wishes to break free, he is acutely aware of his place within a larger social and cultural context. Even as he seeks to establish his own artistic identity, he remains connected to the world in ways that are both visible and invisible. The tension between individuality and societal expectations continues to challenge Stephen, and this internal conflict reaches its apex as he prepares to leave Ireland in search of greater creative freedom. For Stephen, leaving is not just about physical escape. It is about symbolically severing the ties that have bound him to a world that he feels stifles his creativity and sense of self. In this moment of departure, Stephen begins to see the journey ahead as one that is both fraught with uncertainty and full of potential. His decision to leave Ireland represents the final stage in his quest for self-realization. It is an act of profound defiance against the forces of tradition and conformity, an assertion of his commitment to artistic freedom. However, it is also an act of profound isolation. In leaving, Stephen embraces a life of solitude, one in which he must rely solely on his inner resources to define his identity and create his art. He recognizes that, in seeking artistic freedom, he must relinquish the comfort and security of his past and step into a future that is, by definition, unknown and unpredictable. Through his continued rejection of societal and religious expectations, Stephen Dedalus becomes the embodiment of the artist's struggle for individuality in a world that seeks to impose conformity. His journey is one of self-discovery, of moving beyond the limitations of external forces to assert his unique voice. Stephen's growing isolation, both intellectual and emotional, marks the cost of this journey. Yet it also highlights the resilience and determination that drive him to seek out his own path. In his quest for artistic freedom, Stephen is not merely creating art, he is creating himself. As Stephen approaches the final stages of his school life, his intellectual awakening accelerates with an intensity that feels both exhilarating and disorienting. The routine world around him, classes, conversations, daily rituals, feels increasingly foreign, like a stage upon which he can no longer perform without betraying the truth of his inner transformation. Though he continues to walk the same corridors, hear the same bell tolls, and respond to the same authority figures, his mind is elsewhere, consumed by an ever-expanding world of abstract thought and aesthetic theory. He reads voraciously, drawing from Aristotle, Aquinas, and the writings of great poets, forming the scaffold of a philosophy that will define his future artistic vision. The aesthetic theories he begins to shape are not cold abstractions for him. They are deeply felt principles, emerging from the turmoil of his own lived experiences. Beauty, for Stephen, is no longer a distant concept to be admired from afar. It is something to be dissected, understood, and ultimately embodied in one's work. He reflects on the nature of true art and the qualities that distinguish it from mere imitation or propaganda. The question of what makes a work of art beautiful and meaningful preoccupies him constantly, turning over in his mind with a kind of obsessive clarity. He concludes that true art must arise from a fusion of emotion and intellect, form and content, and that it must evoke what he comes to call the aesthetic arrest, a moment when the viewer is stilled, captivated entirely by the work before them, freed temporarily from the pull of desire or repulsion. Stephen's worldview, now taking form with precision, alienates him even further from his peers. He finds himself increasingly disinterested in the casual banter of fellow students, in political debates laced with nationalism, or in the sentimental piety that still clings to many of those around him. Conversations that once might have sparked engagement now elicit only irritation or indifference. His detachment is not born of arrogance, but of necessity. He is tunneling inward, refining the tools he will need to translate the mess of life into the clarity of art. He knows the path he is on will not make him popular, nor will it offer him companionship or comfort. Yet he follows it, as though compelled by something greater than himself, an internal compass that points him always toward expression, creation, and self-knowledge. Yet for all his philosophical insight, Stephen remains a young man, vulnerable to loneliness, doubt, and occasional pangs of guilt. The Ireland he is preparing to leave is not just a landmass or a cultural system. It is the soil of his upbringing, the home of his family, the structure of his language. At times, a shadow of unease creeps into his certainty. Is he abandoning his roots, or merely liberating himself from their hold? Is his quest for artistic freedom a noble pursuit, or a clever mask for pride and cowardice? These questions rise within him uninvited, especially during moments of silence, when walking alone under gray skies or lying awake at night. But Stephen does not allow them to take root. He acknowledges them only long enough to push them aside, reminding himself that all growth requires departure, and that every artist must, at some point, betray what he was born into. His relationship with his family, particularly with his father, becomes more strained as his independence grows. Stephen Dedalus, once a figure of comic bluster and occasional wisdom, now appears to Stephen as a relic of another time, his bitterness and nostalgia a symptom of a life mismanaged and wasted. Stephen views his father's joviality with increasing scorn, recognizing the emptiness beneath it, the pain masked by stories and drink. Though he does not speak his judgment aloud, it shapes the emotional distance between them. Where his father seeks warmth in memory and tradition, Stephen seeks truth in solitude and reinvention. The divide between them is quiet but unmistakable. Even his mother, who clings to the rituals of faith with quiet desperation, becomes a symbol of the world Stephen is preparing to leave. Her gentleness touches him, but it cannot deter him. When she pleads with him to make his Easter confession, her words stir a moment of internal conflict, a flicker of guilt, a reminder of the boy who once knelt in fear before the altar. But Stephen is no longer that boy, and he cannot return to that world without denying all that he has become. His refusal is firm not cruel, and yet it wounds her. The sorrow in her eyes lingers in his mind, but he does not bend. Throughout these final months in Ireland, Stephen begins to write again, cautiously at first, then with increasing conviction. He jots down phrases, images, and theories, shaping the beginnings of a style that will be unmistakably his own. He watches the world with an artist's eye now, not merely seeing events as they unfold, but perceiving their hidden rhythms, their symbolic textures, their potential to be transformed into art. The flight of birds overhead, the glint of sunlight on water, the shape of a girl's cheek, all these become metaphors waiting to be revealed. In his notebooks, he tries to give form to this new language of perception, struggling to capture what cannot be spoken but must be said. And always, beneath it all, is the sensation of movement, a current that pulls him forward, away from the institutions that have failed to nourish him, away from the past that seeks to reclaim him. His decision to leave Ireland crystallizes into resolve, not as an act of rebellion, but as a rite of passage. He is no longer running away from something, but moving towards something greater, a life devoted to creation, to thought, to the pursuit of beauty as he understands it. He is ready to construct his soul anew, to become the smith of his own identity. Even as the horizon remains uncertain, Stephen embraces it. He does not know where the path will lead or what shape his future work will take. But he understands now that to create, truly and freely, he must walk alone. The world he is leaving behind will not vanish, nor will its influences ever completely disappear. But he is no longer beholden to it. He is no longer afraid. The days blend into one another as Stephen drifts through the university, not as a passive student absorbing facts, but as a restless mind resisting definitions. He walks the campus like a ghost, half present in the lectures and conversations, but fully alive only in the inner theater of his thoughts. Professors speak of logic and rhetoric, but Stephen hears the drone of lifeless voices. What interests him now cannot be taught in a room with desks and blackboards. It is something elemental and personal, something no curriculum could contain. He is dismantling the scaffolding of inherited ideas, stripping away the old order so that he can begin, at last, to build his own. His circle of companions has narrowed to a few who speak a similar language, though even among them he feels alone. Cranley, in particular, has become the closest thing to a confidant, though their friendship is charged with an undercurrent of philosophical tension. Cranley is pragmatic where Stephen is idealistic, rooted where Stephen longs to fly. They walk together across Dublin's quays, arguing about morality, faith, loyalty, and solitude, each defending his ground like a soldier protecting sacred territory. Stephen respects Cranley's intelligence, even admires his loyalty and strength, but he knows their paths will not align. Where Cranley seeks a form of grounded stability, Stephen yearns for transformation and flight. In these late conversations, Stephen often finds himself pressed to justify his growing alienation from Catholicism, from Ireland, from the cultural and familial expectations that once enclosed him. Cranley challenges him on these points, not with cruelty, but with urgency. He wants Stephen to be sure, to weigh the cost of his independence. When Stephen declares that he will not serve, that he will not accept the roles offered to him by church, nation, or tradition, Cranley listens in silence. There is a sense that something final is being said, a line being drawn. And though no harsh words pass between them, the air between them shifts. They are no longer simply friends sharing ideas. They are two different spirits, destined to follow divergent paths. Stephen feels this divergence not only in his friendships, but in the very streets of Dublin. The city that once shaped his fears and longings has grown small in his imagination. He walks through it with the detachment of someone already half departed. Familiar landmarks, school gates, church spires, narrow alleyways feel less like home and more like echoes. He watches the people around him go about their routines, speaking in the idioms of conformity, worshiping the icons of patriotism and piety. Their rituals seem to him like sleepwalking. He does not hate them, he pities them, but he cannot be one of them. He turns increasingly inward, filling his notebooks with fragments, phrases, images, questions that will someday, perhaps, become art. He tries to pin down moments of pure experience, the flicker of sunlight on a riverbank, the weight of silence after a prayer, the shape of a bird in mid-flight. These are not just memories for him. They are keys to a deeper reality. He believes now that the artist's task is not to reflect the world as it is, but to reveal the form behind the chaos, to shape the ineffable into something felt. In his search for that perfect expression, he begins to experiment with language itself, dissecting its rhythms, breaking its patterns, seeking new harmonies. There is no mentor guiding him now, no external authority telling him what art should be. He has made the leap from student to seeker, from follower to creator. But this freedom brings with it a terrible solitude. There are nights when the silence of his rented room feels unbearable, when the darkness presses against him like a question he cannot answer. He wonders sometimes if he has lost something essential in his pursuit, some part of tenderness or belonging that he might never recover. And yet, even in these moments of doubt, a deeper voice urges him forward. It tells him that beauty is worth the cost, that truth cannot be found in comfort, and that the soul must be forged, not inherited. At home, tensions remain unresolved. His mother, in quiet despair, still hopes that he will return to the fold, that he will confess, take communion, obey. Her prayers are laced with sorrow. His father, reduced now to anecdotes and tavern jokes, continues his slow decline. The household is a portrait of domestic entropy, filled with arguments, debts, memories, and the creaking machinery of old values. Stephen feels affection, even guilt, for the pain he causes by pulling away. But he also knows that to stay would be to surrender his integrity, to stifle the voice that has begun to emerge within him. His convictions take on new clarity during a long, solitary walk near the sea. The horizon stretches endlessly before him, and for a moment, the chaos of his life recedes. In the sound of the waves and the cry of gulls, he hears something ancient and true. Here, he imagines the future uncertain, uncompromising, and yet entirely his. He recalls the words he once read. The past is consumed in the present, and the present is living only because it brings forth the future. This thought anchors him. He knows now that he is ready to cast off. The time has come not to reflect, but to act. He returns from that walk changed, not in body, but in certainty. He will go abroad, leave Ireland behind not out of disdain, but out of necessity. The soil of his youth has yielded its final harvest. It has fed him with stories, shame, beauty, fear, and fire, can give him no more. If he is to become the artist he envisions, he must step beyond it, into the unknown, into the open sea of creation. As he prepares to leave, he begins recording his thoughts in a journal. These entries, raw and immediate, reveal a voice no longer in formation, but beginning to take flight. He writes not as the hesitant student of the past, but as the architect of his own soul, the artist who will forge his destiny from language and light. His words are filled with resolve. He knows there will be hardship, misunderstanding, and perhaps even failure. But he accepts this. The price of flight is gravity, and he is willing to pay it. He will not serve that in which he no longer believes, whether it calls itself father or faith or fatherland. He will go out into the world with nothing but his mind and his vision. And from that, he will shape something new, something true. The notebook in his pocket is now a living thing, the pulse of his transformation recorded in uneven, hurried strokes. It contains not lectures or arguments, but moments, small epiphanies that appear to him as signs of emergence. The fragments he pens are not merely reflections of the world outside, but the impressions of a soul in the act of becoming. Each phrase is a rehearsal for flight, a declaration against paralysis. And now, as he walks the familiar streets for what might be the final time, the city seems to lean in, as though listening to the decision already forming on his lips. Stephen's movements through Dublin have taken on a ceremonial rhythm. His gaze lingers on corners he once ran past as a boy, places charged with half-buried memories. A stone wall at Clongowes, a chapel door at Belvedere, the bridge near his family's shifting lodgings. These places are etched with pain and joy alike, each carrying a weight he no longer feels compelled to bear. He walks not to revisit the past, but to acknowledge its passage. The world he once strained to understand now feels smaller than his desire to transcend it. Evenings bring the most clarity. In the fading light, the ordinary dissolves into something mythic, and Stephen finds himself contemplating the myths that once shaped him. Dedalus, the master craftsman, the father who dared fashion wings from feathers and wax. That name, once just a schoolboy's curiosity, now burns with personal symbolism. He sees himself in the story, not as the boy Icarus, foolish and doomed, but as the father figure reborn, the one who builds, who escapes, who defies. The wings are not literal. They are language, art, imagination, and they will carry him. He no longer speaks of religion, except in terms of beauty and betrayal. Faith, once a consuming fire within him, has cooled to ash. He does not rail against the church. It is too deeply embedded in the city's bones to argue with. Instead, he sidesteps it, no longer drawn into its rituals or guilt. The prayers of his youth seem now like broken verses, spoken out of fear rather than revelation. But his soul is not empty. He feels instead a new kind of holiness rising within him, the sanctity of creation, of vision, of rebellion shaped by clarity rather than chaos. At the university, he attends fewer lectures, choosing instead to wander the library or walk along the canal, reading whatever he pleases: Aristotle, Aquinas, Dante, Shelley. From each, he extracts not doctrines but insights, the raw material of a philosophy all his own. Art is no longer merely an aspiration. It is the architecture of his salvation. He believes that the artist must detach, must stand outside the common passions in order to see more clearly. He must not be a priest or a politician. He must be a smith, forging soul stuff into form. In moments of solitude, Stephen reflects on the role of the artist in society. The Irish poets he once admired now seem trapped in patriotism, their voices filtered through causes and national grief. He respects them, but refuses their example. His art will not serve a flag or an altar. It will serve only the truth as he sees it, the raw, unfiltered moments of being that defy systems. He sees the artist not as a servant, but as a creator of new myths, a disturber of sleep, a forger of the uncreated conscience. Yet even with this emerging certainty, there are traces of ache. He cannot fully untether from the people who shaped him. His mother's quiet grief lingers in his thoughts. Her world is bound by rosaries and sacrifice, and his defection from faith has wounded her in ways she cannot express. He sees it in her silences, in the tired droop of her eyes, and he carries the guilt of her sorrow like a shadow across his independence. His father, meanwhile, oscillates between comic bravado and fading vitality. The man who once recited Byron now recites debts and Barham tales. Stephen feels both pity and fear, a fear that he too could decay into memory if he remains. Conversations with Cranley grow sparse but heavy. The air between them holds the weight of unsaid things. Cranley still questions him, pushes him, trying to anchor him to something tangible, family, country, belief. But Stephen no longer wants to be anchored. He is not dismissive, only distant. When Cranley asks if he believes in the laws of God, Stephen answers only that he will try to express himself as freely and wholly as he can. It is not rebellion for rebellion's sake. It is a commitment to a life of personal truth. These are not the declarations of an arrogant youth, but the emerging form of a man who has outgrown borrowed voices. His journal entries, increasingly lyrical, read like fragments of an aesthetic creed. He writes of epiphany, the moment when the object is seen in its whatness, when the soul stands still, caught in the act of seeing. He writes of the rhythm of art, the need for silence and form. These are not abstractions to him. They are the tools with which he will sculpt his future. And the future looms now, bright and frightening. The idea of departure is no longer distant. It has become necessity. He will leave Ireland not because he hates it, but because he must outgrow it. The soul, he believes, must rise above the nets of nationality, religion, and language. And to do that, he must fly alone. He does not know where the journey will lead. But he feels, more than ever, that remaining would be a betrayal of the voice stirring inside him. He feels it clearest when walking by the sea. The horizon stretches endlessly, unclaimed and indifferent, promising no answers, only distance. But in that distance lies freedom. He watches the tide recede, leaving patterns in the sand like the memory of something ancient. In the air, the salt mingles with the dusk, and he breathes deeply, as if to fill his lungs with the proof of possibility. The decision has been made, though he has not yet spoken it aloud. His wings are nearly complete, language sharpened, vision aligned, fear acknowledged but not obeyed. He will go, and in going, he will become. The soul he once feared to possess now stands ready. The moment is not dramatic but quiet, like the stillness before dawn. The artist is nearly born. The decision is no longer a matter of will but of motion. Each step Stephen takes now feels like a quiet rebellion against everything he once accepted passively, a against the clipped prayers of childhood, the heavy silences at family tables, the rote lessons spoken by lifeless lips in echoing schoolrooms. He carries no maps, no plans, only a conviction, potent and tender, that he must escape or perish inwardly. His feet do not just walk the earth of Dublin, they walk away from its hold on him. The notebooks he fills brim with an energy that defies grammar. His language is evolving, no longer just borrowed from books or lectures. It is personal now, visceral, shaped by rhythms he hears in thought, in the silence between words, in the murmurs of the sea. He writes not for others, but for the self that is being born line by line. There are moments when he pauses, pen hovering, as if the page itself resists being fixed with anything less than pure honesty. His journals become prayers of a new religion, one in which beauty replaces doctrine and freedom becomes the only sacrament. Each sentence is an incantation, a gesture toward the unknown. The world he describes is still the same Dublin, its narrow lanes, coal smoke, the sullen rain. But in his writing, it becomes mythic, symbolic, transformed. He is no longer recording mere facts, but distilling impressions, seeking the epiphanic truth behind surfaces. Life must not just be lived, it must be revealed. Around him, the voices that once shaped him now sound distant. His mother still clings to hope that her son will return to the fold of the church, that he will kneel again with folded hands and empty himself before the altar. Her prayers are no longer Stephen's burden, but he senses the quiet pain beneath them, and it stirs something human in him, not guilt, but sorrow. She is not a symbol to him, not an idea, but a person who loved in the only way she knew how, even as he slipped beyond her reach. He sees Cranley again, and the final conversation between them crackles with the tension of two souls diverging. Cranley is calm, almost resigned, trying once more to draw Stephen back to something rooted, some shared belief or common allegiance. But Stephen is already elsewhere, not in defiance, but in pursuit. He no longer seeks approval. He speaks of flight, of the soul's need to rise and recreate itself. Cranley listens, perhaps understands more than he lets on, but says little in return. There is no argument left to make. Their friendship dissolves not in anger, but in silence. There are days when doubt still touches him, moments when the weight of isolation presses against his chest like a storm held in the lungs. But those moments pass. They are part of the cost, he believes, of forging a new identity. The artist, he tells himself, must be ruthless not in cruelty, but in courage. He must endure exile, of place, of affection, even of comfort. If he is to sing the song of the soul, he must first listen in solitude. The city remains familiar yet strange. It watches him like an old acquaintance who no longer understands the man he has become. He moves through it with eyes wide open, gathering final impressions like a pilgrim preparing for a sacred journey. The rhythm of Dublin, its laughter, its arguments, its burdens will live in his memory, but no longer dictate his course. Even the language of Ireland, thick with legacy and politics, feels too crowded for what he wishes to express. He will not be a servant of its past, but a creator of something entirely his own. He returns once more to the sea. It has always spoken to him not in words, but in a language of light, sound, and motion. As he walks the shoreline, his thoughts flow with the tide. The sea does not promise safety or clarity, but it does promise movement. And that is enough. It reflects back not a static image, but a self in flux, restless, forming, ready. In his final journal entry, he speaks not of endings, but of beginnings. There is no flourish, no declaration of triumph, only a quiet certainty. He will leave Ireland. He will go into the unknown with only his mind and soul as compass. He will, in his own words, try to forge in the smithy of his soul the uncreated conscience of his race. It is not a mission born of pride, but of necessity. He must leave, not to escape, but to find himself anew. And so he prepares, not with luggage or farewells, but with inward resolve. The boy who once trembled before priests and blushed at the sound of his own name is gone. In his place stands a man uncertain but unafraid, no longer shaped by others' expectations, but by the relentless need to express what lies within. He carries no manifesto, only a sensitivity to life and a fierce devotion to beauty, however it chooses to reveal itself. The future is not outlined. There are no guarantees, but he steps toward it anyway. The wings he imagined as a symbol of escape are now the means of flight. They are not perfect, but they are his. Forged from insight, solitude, and vision, they will lift him toward the life he must create. He walks away from the shore, into the dimming light of evening, and everything he leaves behind falls into hush. The city, the schoolyards, the prayers, the duties, they remain, but they no longer bind. And in that quiet freedom, the artist is born. James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is not merely the coming-of-age story of Stephen Dedalus. It is the spiritual and intellectual evolution of modern consciousness itself. With experimental language and deeply personal introspection, Joyce unshackles narrative from tradition and allows us to inhabit a mind as it forms its own philosophy, its own identity, its own art. The novel's genius lies not in plot, but in transformation. It takes us from the warm, chaotic haze of childhood through the firestorms of belief, guilt, rebellion, and ultimately into a vast, uncharted space where self-invention becomes both the challenge and the reward. In Stephen's flight from religion, family, and country, we witness a radical pursuit of artistic freedom, a commitment to truth that demands exile but yields vision. Joyce does not offer resolution, but revelation, that to become an artist is to risk everything in order to hear the music of one's own soul, and to have the courage to let it sing. In that, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man remains one of the most intimate and daring declarations in all of literature, a testament to the fierce, beautiful cost of becoming oneself.